Shelly Knotts, live from the UK and Australia and some other places. And we will have via network Joanne Armitage from the UK, where it's 3:30 in the morning. So very fortunate to have Joanne as well. We're going to start out with, Shelly's going to present her work, give you a little nickel tour of her work. We're going to do a panel discussion, and then Shelly and Joanne, who perform as ALGOBABEZ, are going to perform for us. Okay, so let's start with Shelly's bio. Shelly is a dado musician. She's currently based in Melbourne, Australia. She performs live coded and network music internationally, collaborating with computers and other humans. She completed a PhD in live computer music at Durham University, UK, with a focus on collaboration and network music. In addition to performing at numerous ALGORAVES and live coding events, current collaborative projects include the ALGO-pop duo ALGOBABEZ with Joanne Armitage, network laptop band AWFUL, which is the Orchestra for Females and Laptops, one of my favorite acronyms ever, and the live coding performance, which I have, sorry for garbling this, Sisesta Pialkiri. Is that about right, Shelly? It's Estonian. Okay.
My bandmate is Estonian.
Okay. It might be Sisesta Pialkiri, but probably isn't quite that, with Alu Alik. In 2017 and 2018, Shelly worked on Improvisational Interfaces, which is a research project exploring how creative computational systems may assist improvisers. And this was at SensiLab at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Before I forget, besides the performance tonight, we also have an exhibition of Shelly's work in the Cal IT Gallery that's closing, I think, is it tomorrow? So be sure to catch the gallery exhibition. And I'm going to turn it over to Shelly. Thanks, Shelly.
Yeah, thanks, Amy, for the introduction, and thanks a lot to Cal IT for hosting my exhibition and inviting me here. It's great to be here. So I have like a million slides and not that much time, so I'm going to sort of rush through this so we can get to the discussion and the panel, which I'm sure will be more interesting. So if I skip over something that looks interesting, feel free to ask me about it later. I'm going to talk about my work. I've sort of called this talk Critical Approaches to Performing with and Through Algorithms, as a sort of attempt to catch the overarching themes of the stuff that I'm doing. Sometimes I refer to them as annoying algorithms because they have a tendency to cause vexation, often deliberately. So just a bit of background, I sort of originally trained as a electroacoustic composer, sort of much more into performance than sitting in a studio for many, many, many hours refining tiny details. After that I got into live coding and network music performance, and those are sort of the two main strands of the stuff that I'm doing now. Most of my projects involve a lot of improvisation and collaboration, so I've worked with like a lot of different people and in different contexts, ranging from working with jazz musicians to in experimental noise contexts. I have some sort of ongoing collaborations and then some stuff which is more ad hoc, which is like the performance in the middle there. I just happened to be on stage with a visualist, and so we did a performance together, and then sort of shorter term projects like a project I did with free improvisers and jazz musicians. So in all of these contexts I'm kind of testing out ways to work with algorithms, live coding, and networks, essentially. This is kind of a diagram I made of my first network music system that I designed. yeah, essentially I thought it kind of captured a bit the sort of messiness of collaboration and working with data and networks. And yeah, this is a piece that starts off quite simple, just direct mapping from controllers to sound, and then over time you sort of build this web of maybe some less direct influence on sound, interdependency between performers and controllers. And after I made this piece, I was sort of really got interested in the sort of non-neutrality of networks. And I really like this quote from Bob Ostertag, where he talks about, it sort of makes a analogy between politics and, well, he's talking about politics, but it kind of captured in some way how I'm thinking about networks when I'm working. So he says that politics refers to actions that attempt to change the balance of power in the strands between nodes, to tilt the balance differently, to shrink one strand and strengthen another, to cut a strand here and make a new connection over there. So yeah, I suppose I'm just really interested in what it means to design a network music system and how you're shaping the interaction between people through the technology. So one of the pieces which there's documentation of in the exhibition is Union, and this is a system for mediating telematic performance. It kind of came out of a pragmatic concern when I was working with Joanne and some others to try to make a female-only laptop ensemble. Yeah, the great thing about laptop music is there's like not that many women. And so if you want to work with other women, it's actually really difficult because they tend to be very spread out. So we decided to make a telematic, like long-distance laptop ensemble. So our members include people in Mexico, Canada, Colombia. I was in Australia for a while, people across Europe. And so Union was a sort of an attempt to look at how you might design a network music system that might mediate that kind of performance in some way. So I made an algorithmic mixer which tries to basically curate the incoming audio, and it's trying to find a way of finding consensus between performers. So I have some algorithms that listen to the sound that comes in and tries to find the most dominant audio characteristics, and it mixes the audio with those characteristics the loudest. So it's trying to basically shape the music on some sort of algorithmic version of consensus. And to balance that out, we try to make sure that everybody gets played for the same amount of time. So there's a sort of conflicting algorithm, which is just keeping track of how much time people have played, and maybe sometimes flipping it and playing the least consenting voice the loudest. So yeah, that's a system diagram if anyone's interested in that stuff. And alongside what's going on there, because it's kind of a complicated system to get your head around what's going on, we also have a graphic which shows you who's playing, and we're also sort of sharing the chat that's going on at the time. So yeah, this is the sort of stuff that we're saying to each other on our sort of back channel about what's going on. So in this performance, people were really happy about what the algorithm was doing. So Annie said, I feel the algorithm is being very egalitarian today. And that's the thing that people actually comment on the most with this piece is this sort of weird narrative that goes on in the back channel. It's kind of a bit of a hacked together system because we're working with a lot of open source technologies and stuff that's very accessible but doesn't always work that well. So there tends to be a lot of technical chat where people are having technical problems, and yeah, people find it kind of strange and interesting that we're projecting that technical narrative alongside the performance. This is some more chat where people are more talking about the sound. And then, yeah, I won't play the documentation because it's in the exhibition. So another piece I made, which was sort of along the same lines of trying to find ways to algorithmically curate collaboration, was a piece called Flock, which is a voting system, but it's a voting system with a population of agents. So I have like 200 agents which have randomly generated specific preferences about the type of audio they want to hear. And they're listening all the time, and at regular intervals they vote for the performer who's playing most similar to what they want to hear. And then over time the system evolves and the preferences change. So even if you keep playing the same thing and you're getting a lot of votes, then because the preferences are changing, the vote count will sort of shift slightly. So I kind of decided, rather than making it audience voting on the performers, I decided to make it agents, because audiences tend to be small in experimental electronic contexts, and also you can't really listen to 3 streams at once and make a judgment in short amounts of time, so that's why we did that. Yeah, and it was kind of interesting actually. After I played with it a few times, I sort of developed some strategies for winning votes. So like sometimes if you play like, well, it depends on the particular set of preferences in that performance, but sometimes if you just play really loud and really noisily, they'll shift to you, so yeah. But not always, so it's fun. Always a new system. So that's the graphic that goes with it, so you can see the performer and how many votes they have. And something about the code that they're writing. Oh yeah, it's for live coding, specifically. It's a performance that we did with it. That's another diagram, which I'll just skip over quickly. So with all of this work, I'm kind of interested in the sort of politics and ethics of technology, and the way how its design has particular implications, and sort of the ethics of being a system designer for collaboration, essentially. So I really like this quote from Thor Magnusson about music software design, which we'll just skip through. And yeah, so live coding, which is the other side of my work, is about performing by writing code. So typically the performer will either have a lot of code that they've written, or they'll be writing everything from scratch in the performance, but the idea is that you're interacting with a running algorithmic process to generate sound or visuals. I won't play the example because we'll hear live coding later. And this is a sort of description of live coding from Rohrhuber and DeCampo, 2009. And they say, and they talk about live coding as a conversational process. So they say the distance between what one may expect an algorithm to have as effect and what the algorithm actually brings about is irreducible. This gap is the thread along which conversational programming is kept moving. So you can sort of unpack this as live coding as a feedback loop between the performer and the algorithm. So it's often very difficult to predict exactly what an algorithm is going to do, though you might have some idea. So it's this sort of layer of unpredictability, which is directing the performance in some way. And so, yeah, some of the things that I got interested in with live coding were to do with listening and failure. So I can't remember exactly what I wanted to say here. Yeah, just that this sort of feedback loop is fairly unpredictable if your algorithms are fairly complex or more than totally basic. So this sense of trying to translate your thoughts into code, sort of introduces this layer of failure into the performance, and listening is kind of the tool with any kind of improvisation, but I'm totally lost in what I'm saying right now. Sorry about this. I'm just gonna.
You're doing a great job.
I made some notes on this slide and they do not make any sense. Anyway, moving on. These are some examples of live coding and listening and failure. The one at the bottom here was a piece by Jonas Hummel, who's a live coder, which I performed with him a few times. And we basically went out into the city and we listened to the sound around us and tried to basically code the sounds that we hear. So you get some kind of externalization of this point of failure, because obviously the sounds that we code are very distant from what you actually hear. So you're kind of hearing this gap through hearing the external sounds and hearing the coded version of the sound. And so you try to get closer to the sounds that you're hearing, but you're also changing the environment as you're doing it. And the other performance at the bottom there is Suzanne, which we don't know how to pronounce, but that's a performance where Allo has some algorithms that listen to what I do, and basically try to mimic it. And I'm live coding along with this, so it's kind of like live coding with a algorithmic version of myself, which is very strange, but also pretty interesting from a performance standpoint. Yeah, that's just some more examples. Yeah, and this idea of failure is very prevalent in the live coding community, so we're sort of valuing openness very strongly. We're always projecting our screen and exposing the process. Often that means you're exposing the things that go wrong. So in this performance at the bottom, I think that's Matthew Euking, but I'm not sure, but you can see there's a lot of things going wrong here on his stream. He's got some errors. And when you're projecting your performance screen, everyone gets to see that essentially. Yeah, and unlike in many parts of computer music and electronic music, system stability isn't necessarily really a requirement. Crashing happens a lot in live coding. This is a performance where, yeah, my whole sound cut out in front of an audience of 200 people, which was fun. And yeah, that's what's going on there. And I was feeling pretty sad about it, but the organizer of the gig was just like, yeah, that's fine, because that's just what happens in live coding. So there's this kind of general consensus that crashing and failure and live coding all go hand in hand. Yeah, live coding is really challenging a lot of norms of performance, electronic music. It's sort of anti-perfection. Failure is part of the narrative, so we hear the failure and we see it. But this unpredictability means you often go different places than you would have thought of otherwise. Yeah. I think I'm going to skip over the virtuosity stuff, because probably we don't have much time left. I don't know. How much? Yeah. I'll skip through it. That was my Star Trek moment. I made a piece about cognitive virtuosity and EEG sensors. I think it's also in the exhibition. Ask me about it later if you want to. And yes, ALGOBABEZ will be performing later tonight. So we're a live coding duo. At some point we were the only 2 women live coding in the UK, so we made a band together, called it ALGOBABEZ. And yeah, we kind of always put forward this very resistant kind of front, because we're often going into sort of very tech culture spaces as women who code as a performance. Yeah, we're sort of trying to put ourselves forward as resistant to that culture. Alex McLean said we broke ALGOBABEZ, which is totally fine. Alex McLean is like the father of live coding, and he invented ALGOBABEZ.
Can you explain ALGOBABEZ, and because I'm not sure everybody's familiar with it, and also explain how you broke it?
Yeah, so ALGOBABEZ is a sort of global movement of live coding where we live code algorithmic dance music in club type spaces. I think he's referring to the first gig that we played actually, where it was at Leeds Digital Festival, which is has a very sort of code bro culture, and we played after someone who played very standard techno, and then we played extremely noisy sort of broken beats and stuff, and also literally the speakers were smoking at the end of our performance. Yeah, oops. And yeah, this is a clip from that performance, except it's not going to work. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry, it's not working. Anyway, that was just a clip from us breaking speakers and human eardrums. More recently, we've been doing some projects to do with embodiment. So Joe's work is very concerned with physical computing and vibration and haptics. So we've been sort of folding that sort of strand into our performances. The first one we did was Babe Nodes, where we sort of require the audience to dance, and we take their heart rate and use that as an input into our system. So if they don't dance, then the music's very slow and not very danceable. So yeah, we're sort of turning it back on the audience and making them dance for us. Jason Levine, who was another live coder, apparently was happy with that. So I just thought I would finish with a quote from Liza Lim, who says that she proposes that the aesthetic dimension and what we do as artists is a profoundly useful way of experimenting with what the world is like and can be. Through art, we can experiment with forms that contain, split and spill, organize and disorganize. Those forms expose hierarchies that show prioritizations and investments in different values. Their rhythms reveal how we pattern and repeat those values. They show how we were linked to people and their ideas and their labor. Yeah, just some random thoughts to end with. So in a lot of my work, I'm sort of using algorithmic systems as a helpful irritant, so a way to maybe annoy people but push us in different directions as improvisers. It's sort of interfacing with complexity. A lot of the performances that I do, it's not always possible to know exactly what's going on, but sort of navigating that sort of interesting, complex space. The network music stuff, I'm sort of mediating some performances using data collection as well as algorithms. I'm interested in how these systems and these technologies are impacting human musical agency. So how we might be stopping or encouraging particular musical agency. Yeah, let's just stop it there and get on to the panel, I think. So thanks for listening.
Our panelists can join us in the boardroom. we're sharing mics.
Okay.
Share one person.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's fine.
All right, well, I'll start us off, and then, you know, maybe everybody can just sort of, oh, well, we should introduce the panel, of course. Why don't everybody just sort of briefly give us a couple sentences about yourself on the way down? Starting with Curt Miller, our
Okay.
out-of-town visiting guest.
Back in town. So I'm Curt. I'm primarily a clarinetist. I guess I would say I'm primarily a clarinetist working with scores, but improvisation ends up cropping up in a number of practices. I also do some sound art installation work, and often involving sort of long time span improvisatory performances within them. So let's start with that.
And I'm Amy Alexander. I'm on the faculty in visual arts here, and I do a lot of time-based visual performance, live visuals, and I've been working with Curt on a live improvisational audiovisual performance called the Percussive Image Gestural System, or PIGS.
Hi, I'm Michael Trigilio, and I'm also faculty in the visual arts department here. I'm a multimedia artist, and a lot of my work is grounded in sound design, sound art, and practice in music. I have a background in music and found my way to visual arts from that place. So.
I'm Suzanne Thorpe, and I'm a PhD candidate here in the music department, the integrative studies area of music. I am an electroacoustic improviser and compose site-oriented sound installation. Both of those things I use various technologies for. I also run an organization that introduces girls to technology through DIY electronic music.
And I'm David Borgo. I'm a professor in the music department. Saxophonist coming out of sort of the jazz, modern jazz tradition, free jazz, into free improvisation and electroacoustic improvisation. I've also written a lot about chaos and complexity theory and how they might afford a lens through which we can understand some of these musics and practices.
So, Shelly, what I'm thinking is most of us have some background in traditional music, you know, hitting things or strumming things or blowing into things. And so there's this kind of traditional approach to improvisation with technology that says, okay, you need to make your technology more intuitive because technology is innately not well suited towards liveness or humanness or improvisation. And therefore, we need to make things work more like traditional musical instruments or some other thing. And you don't seem to approach your work that way. So I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I suppose I'm interested in how digital technology and algorithmic systems are different to acoustic instruments. I mean, there's no direct relation when you're working with an algorithm between what you do physically and the sound that comes out. I trained as a classical violinist, which is like a very direct physical relationship. And so I suppose what I got interested in really is how this is different to other forms of music making and how we might exploit that in new and interesting ways.
I think, to me, as someone who often improvises, still just on the clarinet, I think one of the benefits of adding electronics into, say, an electronic acoustic improvisation with the clarinet is that it disturbs the very clear one-to-one relationship that people expect coming out of the clarinet, that you can create systems that kind of, that sort of walk a line between the two.
I think that's true, but I think it's also fascinating how many themes appear in your work that also appear in purely acoustic improvisation, in the sense that often musicians are pushing their relationship with the instrument to the point of uncertainty. These sort of complex feedback cycles. I mean, what they often call extended techniques are essentially those moments when instruments aren't responding the way we expect them to. That being said, I did have sort of a question, because, I mean, so many of the themes come up, like failure and irritation and annoyance, and these are true whether you're improvising with acoustic instruments or electronics. But I wonder, this idea of broadcasting the back channel, or when it's visible that it says system error, in a way, that makes it a little more binary to the audience that, oh, there is an obvious failure, whereas someone like Miles Davis playing the trumpet, if he cracks a note, it's not necessarily a failure, and in fact, it makes the performance that much richer that we can feel that complexity and even the struggle that's involved. I wonder if there's a way to have that translate to the sort of the live coding scene where failure is not so black and white, or am I misreading the way you're understanding failure?
Yeah, I'm not sure I really see failure as black and white, but maybe as it's often as a different opportunity, or something you hadn't really intended, or it wasn't what you were aiming for, but takes you somewhere new. I think not all, okay, it's on the screen, and if you're very avidly following the coding, you'll always see this this error message come up. But I think there's a lot of many different ways you can fail with live coding. I mean, just simple things like syntax errors where you put a comma in the wrong place, or two things where you might add an extra zero where there shouldn't be one, and your system blows up because of it. So I really see it as like a broad spectrum, and the outputs of it being very varied, and also that and also include in there the failure that you don't see, which is a sort of failure of formalization, so that you're writing a code and you think it does one thing, but actually what you end up with is something entirely different, which I think is probably very similar to what you're talking about with instrumental improvisation, actually.
I had a question to kind of a jumping off question of the narrative that runs in the background, shall we say, and whether or not that provides a space for performer legibility or identity in the performances, and to dovetail that question, how does anonymity work into the democratic spaces that you are trying to foster?
Okay, it's a big question. I think I'm not really approaching it from that perspective. So with Offal, where we have the chat thread, actually it's a way of trying to humanize what's going on and trying to show that there's this group of real people that are behind the performance that's going on. So yeah, everyone has their name in the chat, but actually, yeah, I suppose the audience don't necessarily know who they are, because they're a disembodied sort of text,
Right.
not even voice, but and there's no way to relate that back to the sound that's going on either. But yeah, no, we see it more as a way of humanizing the technology, and also giving the performers some presence in the concert hall, even if it's not the ideal type of presence.
Mm-hmm. But you each know, most likely, do you each know each other's handles?
Yeah.
So there's almost like a running kind of sense of accountability, or like being able to know who's doing what in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Is that also something that happens?
Yeah.
through that?
Yeah, I suppose so, yeah.
Mm.
One of the things that I'm struck by, and I don't have the background in improvisation that either of you have, But when I've spoken with, I used to have an old argument with composer John Bischoff about this and his max patches for the TX-81Z, and I would always ask where the line for him was between it being an instrument and it being a score. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways in which I always wanted to sort of perform a John Bischoff piece using his patch, right? But it's his patch. And so it was a kind of a tension. It was kind of an interesting tension to me, more so for me than him. And one of the things I'm interested in improvisation with live coding is when I see an improviser in the acoustic space, there's not like a residue left behind that I could read as a score. But I feel like when I've seen live coding works, there is this kind of visual residue, this sort of the super collider patch and the back and forth between the players that I'm sort of curious, do you think about, not so much on the authorship side, because I understand it as an improvisation, but as an artifact of the performance, would you consider it a score or something that could be reproduced in some way from your improvisation as a generative act?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, interesting you brought up John Bischoff as well, actually. Like, he was a huge influence in when I first got into network music. And yeah, but sorry, getting back to the actual question. To be honest, I mean, there are ways you could technologically try to keep a history of everything, everything that's happened in the live coding performance, but personally, I don't. I often keep the end state, but I really see that as like, that is the code as it was in one particular moment, but I don't think I would be able to go back from that and follow the steps through and what happened. And even in when I first started live coding, I would have this sort of like folder of old files that I used, and if I was having a sort of sticky moment where I didn't know what to do, I would just take something at random and copy it and paste it back in and use it in that performance. And I would never use it in the same way that I had used it in the first place. So yeah, I think I don't, for me, I don't see code documents in the same way that I see scores or even sort of standard documentation of performances, just because it's this sort of like living and moving document.
Kind of interested in the politics of network improvisation, especially the algorithm you talked about that kind of curates which way you're going based on can you talk a little bit more about how that, because any improvisation is kind of this social, right, this social balancing act, right? And I'm interested, I guess, in two things. One is, how does that social interplay differ when you're live improvising versus when you are remote, everybody's in different places, versus when this algorithm comes in and starts making decisions?
Okay, yeah, sure. So when I first started doing my PhD, I had this great idea that I was going to make non-hierarchical network music systems, and quickly realized that that's not a thing. But
why is it not a thing?
So, for example, with that piece, what I was trying to do was essentially remove the need to have somebody in the room who's somehow managing the performance, because and the reason that we need anyone to manage it at all is just because we have like if you have 10 performers who are in different places, and we're using this software which has like a 5-second plus delay on it, so it's really hard to have any sort of like direct collaboration. So there's this kind of need to have some sort of management, and so I made the algorithm because I wanted to not have a human be the thing that's managing it, because then they're obviously more in control of the performance than anyone else. But then when you get into thinking about system design and the role of system designers, you obviously realize, yeah, okay, but I've designed that system and I've made a ton of choices, and yeah, so there's still obviously a hierarchy there, but I suppose it tries to push back against necessarily having that hierarchy at performance time.
Do you find like the people behave differently, like they're more assertive because they're, well, it's just the algorithm that's going to reject me if I get rejected instead of getting rejected by actual people?
That's a good question. Actually, I'm not sure. We definitely perform really differently with that system than we do with others. So we have another performer where it's more performance, where it's more of a conversation, and you can give performance directions, but then you need to have like more than 50% of the people vote on the performance direction for it to actually become part of the score. Somehow we tend to play more noisy music with that one, whereas Union tends to be quite drony and soft. So I don't know. Yeah.
Have you tried collectively? Sorry. Hello. Have you tried collectively making the algorithm?
Yeah. So that's this other performance
constructed?
system. This other performance system was a collaborative design. Yeah.
Okay. And do you find that that's more or less successful, or like with the group?
I think they have more buy-in to the system where there's been, they've participated in the design of the system. Yeah.
I'm curious too about as I hear you describing the algorithm, sort of a signal routing or a mixing or a stream management algorithm, and your question is, do you feel like it was more successful? And I'm curious, just for you as a performer in an ensemble, do you feel like a successful performance for you is one in which the algorithm routed and democratized and broke down the hierarchy of the mix, or is it more about, or do you find you are more responsive to the sounds themselves? Because there's these sort of two pieces of the AlgoRave for your project, the live coding.
Yeah.
There's the sounds that are being generated, the oscillations and whatever other sounds, and then there's this sort of stream management system that is. And I'm curious about where your investment, how you kind of see success or how you see failure with regard to those two systems. Failure with a positive, like a good failure. Good failure, not big F failure.
I mean, I suppose a algorithmic system that does something super interesting but achieves really rubbish music is probably not really a successful system design. But I'm also very aware of the fact that I have a particular interest in algorithms which push back and sort of subvert the process in some ways, and sometimes collaborators are less happy with that.
I see. Yeah. So that becomes about the collaboration then.
Yeah. So
you.
there's always in those systems maybe some conversation that has to happen, and maybe some taming.
Yeah, sure.
So.
Do we have any questions from anyone in the audience? Yeah.
It seems like in many more traditional performance aspects that rehearsal is a big part of the process that goes into performance. And I'm wondering if you could talk about what rehearsal means.
No, I'll just repeat it into the mic because I know we're recording. What part does rehearsal play in the type of performance you're doing?
I think that varies a lot from project to project. With live coding performances, I think I was practicing a lot in the beginning, but now I'm sort of performing so much that that's kind of the rehearsal. And that sort of applies also to the collaborations I do in live coding. So with Joanne, I think maybe we played together like just to make sure that the tech setup worked for like 15 minutes or something before we did our first rehearsal. But we knew each other very well, and we knew each other's music, so we didn't really, it didn't really feel necessary anyway. And I also do a lot of improv where I just turn up at the show with someone I've never played with, or sometimes never even met before, and then we just do something together, which it happens a lot, I think, in like free improvisation scenes. Stuff like Awful, because the technical setup is so difficult, probably our rehearsal is more or less learning the system and learning how to set it up, learning how to play with it. So a lot of the time it's more about the technical side rather than necessarily learning how to play music together, which is, maybe kind of interesting.
I mean, just as a humorous aside, I've often thought we need a different word for improvisers and laptop coders and the like, because rehearsal implies to rehear something, and the goal is not to rehear. So essentially, one learns by doing in those kind of contexts. Yeah.
Any questions? Well, go ahead.
So I'm a software engineer, and to me, coding is a tool that was designed to exactly specify a very complex system. And to me, and in industry, live coding is something that's kind of like a sin, right? You don't want it to be improvised. It was definitely designed not to improvise. So why is code the right tool for you to make the art you're trying to make?
Interesting. I think the reason I started live coding was because I was doing a lot of laptop performance already, but I was usually using like pre-coded systems where a lot of decisions had been built into the system in advance, and maybe they might be like complex decisions that have a range of variation. But as soon as I started working with jazz musicians, I found that I didn't have enough choices in performance. So really doing live coding to me was a way of putting off as many decisions as possible until the performance time. And I found that to be a much more improvisational way of using computer music tools than any other way I'd done improvisation with a laptop before.
So it does work for you, even though you have a lot of failures.
Oh yeah, the failure is part of the fun.
Right, maybe so that Joanne in England can go to bed, maybe we should move on to the performance, and
Sure.
then we'll take some more time for questions afterwards.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you very much, panelists.
Is the screen on?
Oh, the other screen.
The second screen.
Second screen. Thank you, Shelly, and thank you, Joanne. I guess Joanne probably wants to get some rest before. Right, we'll do some more Q&A, but maybe I don't know if Joanne wants to hang out or if she's just kind of falling asleep because it's 4 a.m. Okay, thanks, Joanne. All right. So let's see if anybody else has some questions for Shelly. Yes, Ian.
What were you using processing for?
The question was, what were you using processing for?
So we have these.
Speaking to the mic.
Yeah. So we have these wristbands that we've been trying out recently, which is essentially taking some biometric data and sending it as vibrations across the internet. So it was just a little visualization of that. So, but yeah, I stopped it because my computer was freaking out. So, yeah.
Just the visuals?
It's just a sort of small visualization of what's going on with the armbands.
Ah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this software called Super Collider. It's like an audio programming language. Super Collider? Yeah. No problem.
So Shelly, hi.
Hi.
This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
By the way, if you want to speak
Should
into
I
the
go
mic,
there?
you'll be on, yeah, we can record you.
Shelly, hi. This is wonderful. Thank you so much. It's very fun. So my question to you is more of a general question. And maybe it's a loaded question. I'm thinking of a lot of different things. I just watched a video of Google Assistant, for instance. I don't know if everyone knows this. Now this assistant can make phone calls and reserve spots for you. And he or she sounds eerily, you know, like a hipster. It's awesome. But it's also really interesting to think about. So my question is, following on that, where do you see the future of live coding in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years?
That's a lot
Now
of time
back and you
scales.
answer.
Yeah, I think essentially that it'll get integrated as a tool into a lot of other things. So there's quite a few people who are working now with more like hybrid systems, so they might have some sort of physical controller as well as the live coding system, which gives you kind of the best of both worlds, that you have this like very editable system that you can change in the moment, but then you also have some sort of bodily control that's a bit more graspable. So that's sort of, I think, a really interesting area of development. I'm not sure about timescales.